Welcome back. And just a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question at any time, you can do so via the stage chat box to the right-hand side of your screen. Now, has there ever been a better moment to talk about freight? Global supply chains are under immense pressure, while simultaneously the industry needs to work out a path to decarbonisation. So to discuss this big topic, I'd like to introduce Lance Bultena, the Global Director of Thought Leadership, Mobility and Transportation at Hogan Lovells, Martina Niemann, Chief Financial Officer at DB Cargo, the rail freight company owned by Deutsche Bahn, Maggie Simpson, Director General at the industry body, the Rail Freight Group here in the UK, and Marla Westervelt, Director of Policy at the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. So welcome one and all. I think it would be best to start by discussing the here and now and the supply chain crunch that the freight industry is experiencing. And as we have Maggie and Martina here, we might start by thinking about what's happening to rail freight at the moment. So Martina, if we come to you first, how has the demand for freight changed at your company?
That has changed quite significantly, I have to say. Following the economic effects of the corona crisis, there was a great upturn to rail freight. It depended on two, I think, main levers. The first thing was that during corona, rail freight was a very reliable source of transport with respect or compared to the truck. When the borders were shut, the trains were still running when the trucks had to stop at the very beginning. That made many of our customers change their minds regarding rail freight. And the other thing is that rail freight does have such a huge decarbonization potential, which is also in line with the needs of our customers, and that is driving up the volumes we see in our system.
Mm. And Maggie, I mean, is there, just thinking about the UK industry, UK rail freight, is there enough capacity to actually meet the demand at the moment?
So, yeah, I mean, like Martina, we're seeing it being very busy at the moment, and we're seeing customers wanting more rail freight, a combination of factors, that increased resilience that Martina's talked about coming as an after effect, both of COVID and actually in the UK's case of Brexit as well, as some supply chains are moving. A drive for sustainability, absolutely, and then responding to issues like the shortage of road drivers, which are particularly acute in the UK as well. So we are seeing a demand for services, and of course the capacity of the railways is not infinite. But what we're finding we're able to do, particularly under pressure from those customers, is make trains run longer, making sure that every bit that can be loaded is loaded, and working with the infrastructure manager, Network Rail, to make sure that we're running trains more at the weekends when traditionally they maybe haven't run, and that we're effectively aligning how Network Rail maintain the network to make sure as many trains as possible can keep running around that. And of course, in the longer term, it is about investing in the network and digitisation, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later on to build up that capacity. But right now, this moment, the issue is about making sure we can run as many trains for those customers as we realistically can.
So some great flexibility at the moment in the rail market to deal with the demand. But Lance, if we turn to you and maybe broaden things out to think of the wider supply chain crunch. I mean, it's such a huge issue. It's hard to know where to start, isn't it, as far as trying to ease things, trying to deal with that additional demand?
Yeah, it is a huge issue. And I think that requires all of us as people in the industry, as policymakers, as advocates for one issue or another, to have some humility, because it really is a global network of production, distribution, and consumption. And that means we're going across policymaking jurisdictions. We're using multiple modes. And I think what we've seen with this increase in demand is that there's always been some, maybe not a lot of excess slack in this system. Driver shortages, issues at ports, we can go through a lot of issues. And we're now seeing them all come together at one time. And that's giving us a chance to focus on these issues and figure out how we can use data, a better analysis to try and optimize this problem in a more efficient way.
And Marla, just on that, I mean, to what extent can technology and digitization offer actually some tangible potential ways out of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I'll start by saying, technology is just one of the tools in the toolkit, but I do think for this industry specifically, there's a lot of potential there. So right now we see about 30% of freight miles are empty and about 20% of our assets at any given time are idling and producing emissions. And obviously that's a huge problem. And one of the key ways in which we can overcome that problem is that thing that we learned in kindergarten, to communicate better. And communication at a scalable level necessitates digitalization. You need to be able to very easily push out data saying, my ship is leaving port, I'll be arriving, here's my updated speed, and here's when I'm actually going to be there in the port, being able to communicate back. And then also, within intermodal transfers, you can also have a lot of ability to get through a facility faster and also go towards the lowest emitting mode. So I'm really excited about the potential of digitalization and what this crisis, the conversation that we've been able to open up around that issue.
Well, let's think about communication and ask Maggie and Martina about that. Maybe Maggie, you first. Is there enough communication in the industry between all the various disparate parts of it?
So I think it's a really interesting question, and one of the reasons that freight and supply chains have been as successful as they have, and actually, until, as Lance says, until the resilience was tested to its limit by a crisis, actually very efficient, has been that it's a competitive market, and competition and communication and collaboration aren't always friends with each other, and so one of the balances that we're having a lot of conversations with about our members is how do you drive collaboration but still allow people that commercial flair, because if you don't have commercial flair, you then don't innovate as well, because it's winning that next contracts that drives you to look at your technology. So it's a really challenging balance point for people in how best to do that. But certainly I think one of the real positives that has come out certainly here in the UK is that people have actually begun to understand that freight happens. We are talking about freight as a society now in a way that we've never done before. And just the knowledge and understanding that people have of how supply chains work and their impact on them and vice versa is becoming really illuminating. We actually have government ministers at the moment wanting to know about freight transport. And, I've been in this job 20 years near enough, and that's never really happened before. So that awareness is hugely powerful at the moment, and I'm sure is being reflected across the globe as well.
Yeah, Martina, what do you think about that? Do you think, are you sort of having that input from policymakers you haven't seen before, and how useful is that?
Extremely helpful. I really have to strongly agree to what Maggie said. The interest of, on the one hand side, policymakers, but on the other hand side, financial sources wanting to invest in rail is giving up a big boost. And I think we will need that. To come back to what Marla just said, there is communication in rail freight, but too slow. It's not to the speed the customer would like to have. They are only the first, competitors in the system starting to get booking a container traffic as easy as you can get to have an e-commerce booking if you buy a t-shirt, whatever, on a global perspective. So these communication means and the linkage between customers and suppliers have to be speeded up in a way. And I think that's why the digitization aspect is so important. And secondly, that will also have to be applied to the assets. We are talking the digital automated coupling all across Europe, I think, since the 60s of the last century. Now it seems to be that this can come true, and this will give the whole system a boost and will need a lot of investment. So the interest of the regulators, the interest of the governments, of the customers, and of global finance will be helping to get that ready.
Lance, I was struck by what Maggie was saying about how suddenly we're all talking about freight. It's suddenly in the open, having, I guess, kind of worked behind the scenes for such a long time. Do you think that's beneficial for the industry, that we're all actually aware that it happens, and that also there can be issues in the supply chain?
Yes, I do think it's beneficial. And I guess the reason I think it's beneficial is that something I said earlier. that it's a really complex network. And it's like everything else. When everything's going great, we don't focus on it. And that means we also miss opportunities. And I'm an optimist, although there are challenges, because we are now focusing. And what we can, I remember when digital mapping first came out, I found out that I'd been traveling a route for 10 years and I'd missed a little something that shaved some time off. And right now, freight is largely a paper-based business, a lot of relationships. It's not optimized across modes. And with data and the way we're now thinking about things, we can solve two optimization problems, or we'll start to do so better. The first is what is produced and where it's produced and when it's produced, because that decreases how much has to be shipped, and you have to just ship the right stuff. That takes volume out and adds resiliency. And then you can optimize what is made and how it's shipped, the right modes, the right ways, the right connections, who's got space, who doesn't have space. And with that knowledge, then the private sector and the public sector can work together to get the infrastructure right. And that sounds like a complex chain. But when we don't have a visibility to a problem, nobody solves anything and inertia takes over. Now we're looking at things and we have the opportunity to really make the world better. So I'm excited about that.
Marla, I see you nodding there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lance is absolutely right. The one rule of policy is inertia, and you have to have a large input to change that. And I think it's really exciting that we have the opportunity to take lessons from other industries on how to do this in an effective, scalable way. So I've spent a lot of my career working in passenger transportation and passenger transportation data standards, and it really is the nexus of the public and private sectors and the interests of both of them that have driven towards standards that have allowed Lance to be able to use his digital mapping tools and have the insight of both what's happening on the road as well as the rail. And so I think having that clear model of how to move forward is really exciting. And while this crisis is a crisis, it opens up the opportunity in a way that we've never had before.
And Maggie and Martina, we've spoken a lot about collaboration and how important that is. I'm going to give you the opportunity to blame other parts of the sector for the crunch that we're having at the moment, because when you speak to shipping industries, they'll say, oh, all the pinch points are on land. From your perspective, where are the key pinch points in the supply chain? Maybe Maggie, you first.
So I think, I can speak from the UK perspective, but actually I think, that sort of a freight blindness that we've had for a number of years has led to some, sort of structural deficiencies. So, there aren't, for example, enough big warehouses in the UK, particularly with, people trying now to build in a little bit more resilience, and that's been the sort of the creeping growth of online. Have really, sort of accelerated through the pandemic, meaning that people want more floor squares in warehouses. They don't exist because the planning system isn't configured to deliver warehouses. It's configured to deliver houses. So there are structural things underneath the current crisis, which were always there or have been for some time, and are beginning now to be stretched by that demand for resilience. We've found that some of the rail terminals that we have aren't really big enough because people are demanding more container storage than we've got capability for. And that's been backwashing into service provision. Trains haven't been able to unload because there's not been places to put containers. And the ports are finding the same stretch, particularly those with small land footprints that haven't got the space for storage. So some of this is about that core infrastructure, which was designed around the optimized system, but hasn't got the space in it to cope with stress, really.
Martina, do you see the same issues?
Yes, I would agree that there's two major points: the resilience issue on the one hand side, and the issue of intermodal shifts. So the container crunch started when Corona led the Chinese harbors to a closure. And then that infected the whole system with masses of transports, which we now see as the crunch situation Maggie just described. Also in Central Europe, you can see that shippers are looking for places to store containers somewhere all across the area. But the other aspect is that in the times before COVID crisis, the supply chains were designed in a way that warehouses were basically happening on our highways. The left two aisles were basically reserved for trucks carrying the daily amount for all the big production companies, at least what we see in Central Europe, and I think in UK it was quite the same. When then the supply chains got infected by the aftermath of the virus, then it didn't function anymore, and the system went into imbalance. Now, everything has to be organized in a way that nearshoring is one aspect, getting out the redundant transports with what Marla just said, with filling the routes a little bit more efficient than we do at the moment. And on the third thing is getting easy access between the different modes of transportation. So the continental railroads, of course, the truck system, but also the national shipping system have to be combined easier. And that is what is seen all across Europe, I would say. It's big investments in terminals, and dual modal or three ways of modals combined there should be the first thing to repair.
I mean, Lance, you spoke about the need for some humility during this crisis. Is that the case? Do we need a little bit more, I don't know, elasticity or a little bit more give in the system so that when these crises happen, there's just a little bit more to give?
Yes, but let's be optimistic. I mean, we can talk about the problems, but first let's take a look just to frame it. We have a global system of production, distribution, and consumption that allowed us to do what Martina talked about, having just-in-time distribution where people just did not think about that logistical system. And consumers are getting products all over the world from all over the world. And that's really quite amazing. That's allowed economic development and a living standard that is unprecedented in human history. If Adam Smith in 1776 could have realized specialization of labor on that scale, I think he would have been just so excited. That doesn't mean we don't have problems. And those problems will, I think, allow us to say, all right, we need to invest in some infrastructure because there are bottlenecks. And that's going to take public and private investment. And to facilitate that investment and have it happen on a global scale, there's going to need to be a fairly strong cooperation between the private sector and the public sector with some new rules and some flexibility. But we're seeing a discussion about infrastructure all over the world in a way I have not seen for a very long time. And that's a good thing for how this is going to work out. And then with the new tools that Marla was talking about with data, that'll allow us to help find that low-hanging fruit, to find out where the bottleneck is. And I think we're at the cusp of something great, but it's going to be uncomfortable for a while as we work through that.
And Marla, just on that, with the idea of investment and the possibilities from data and digitization, where should that investment be aimed to sort of unlock those possibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first investment that needs to be made is the development of data standards. And we're having many data standard conversations across the world. There are standardizations happening in Europe. There are interest groups focusing on specific parts of the supply chain. The US federal government said it's time for us to create a data standard. And all of that is great, but we kind of need to come together as a full freight value chain because having a bunch of disparate standards doesn't actually help. The next thing we need to do is be able to do that with the public and private sectors at the table. The Achilles heel of a data standard is that it's not implementable. And by not implementable, I mean we've overbaked it. We've made it a really, really complex thing for a software developer to have to tend to. That's not going to work in the long term. So we need to figure out what are the key pieces of information that we need to be able to optimize our operations, and how do we get those data out quickly? So I think that's number one. And I think number two is we need to create both an environment where there are incentives to produce these data, as well as some beginnings of requirements for producing these data, because the big capital investment is the data standard and the data production. Once you've done that, it's actually pretty easy to use the data. Software companies can very quickly start to ingest these standardized specifications and give you ways to communicate across the supply chain, that to some it's going to feel like overnight as soon as those data streams are turned on.
And on that, Maggie, I mean, how much opportunity do you see within the rail freight sector for data, for digitization? Do you see that sort of the huge opportunities that Marla does?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think it cuts in a number of places. And, Marla's talking there, I think, particularly about sort of the flow of goods around the world and through various economies where there's, that insight will help people optimize what they do and look at the modal choices that they have more readily than they do today. I think, it's also really important to look at that kind of the data that we get on the asset and the data that we get from the infrastructure itself. So, it's relatively easy to digitize a locomotive or a wagon or a truck. That they move around, you can put those monitors on them. It's relatively difficult to digitize the infrastructure. And so we sometimes, we end up in situations, we certainly are in the UK, where, the data that comes from the track is using systems that were built in the 1970s. And then, funnily enough, that doesn't interface very well with people who are trying to build locomotives in the 2020s. So we need to be mindful that it's about having a standard for the data, but it's also being sure that we've got the assets enabled to provide data as well. And that's sometimes, I think, where it gets quite complicated, particularly when your core networks are operated by governments.
A complex challenge. Let's think about another one, which is decarbonisation and the decarbonisation of the freight industry and of global supply chains. Maybe, Lance, I'll start with you. And I mean, just can you put into some sort of perspective, how big a challenge is it to try to decarbonise the supply chain? I suppose it's hard to begin to know where to start.
It is, and since I used that word humility once, I'll use it twice. If there's ever a place for humility, it's the complexity there, because I mean it's relatively easy to go to international conferences and say we're going to decarbonize, and it's very hard to do in practice because the transportation system is not homogeneous. Every mode has a different need and a different route and a different need for energy density of the fuel. Even if you were to talk about one particular mode, maybe medium duty or heavy duty trucks, if they ride on a circuit, you have greater opportunities to electrify than if they move in an ad hoc fashion. So we really have to kind of break that down, create the infrastructure, understand how that particular mode gets the force it needs to move things around, and then break it down. But there is one, I think, good piece of news, Philip, and that is that regulation and the markets are moving synergistically for the first time that I've seen. It used to be if you had an increase in stringency about emissions, that was a problem in the financial markets. Now we have regulators. The financial markets are rewarding the focus on sustainability through the ESG effort, and companies are looking for their branding exercise to decarbonize. That means things are kind of moving in the same direction. So it's a complex problem, but at least everybody's kind of pointed in the same way.
And Lance, you mentioned sort of the electrification of goods vehicles there. We've got a question from the floor actually on this. I mean, how close do you think we are to sort of an e-highway and having to have overhead cables to power trucks when we think about net zero?
Wow, that's a lot of infrastructure. I mean, I hate to mention railroads, and we have two experts there, but in the United States, our railroads are not electrified, and there's a lot of discussion. You could find oodles of papers debating whether it's actually cheap to electrify just the railroads or whether it's impossibly expensive, and back and forth. So if you bring that analysis to the roadways, it's get a lot harder. So when I look at electrification of the delivery network, I would say the relatively light duty vehicles, the kind of thing that deliver our packages that we've ordered from our favorite retailer, that's going to get electrified relatively easily. Then the things that run on a circuits where things return back to a holding area where the vehicle on a regular basis, well, that's the next thing to get electrified. And I'm quite optimistic about that happening quite quickly. Big shippers are making orders. We just have to get the batteries in the vehicles all together. When you get to heavy duty vehicles that are moving in an ad hoc fashion, well, then you might have to think about things like hydrogen and other things for a while because batteries are heavy. and you have to move the battery around. When you have liquid fuel, as you consume the fuel, weight comes out of the system. With the battery, the weight's a constant. So, I mean, there are real complications there, and the technology is going to come along. But I think we have to look at, when we look at sustainability and taking out carbon, it's not the sole answer is not just electrification. There are other things that have to be considered.
And Martina,
Yeah,
thinking, sorry, carry on, Marla.
Sorry, I just wanted to build on that answer. You know, I went to COP26 a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that I found is a lot of folks said, yeah, we'll be able to electrify eventually, but are we going to hit our targets? Probably not. And to me, that's why I'm so excited about this digitalization piece is, you know, we do need to do electrification. We do need to shift our fuel resources. That is a necessary condition, but we're running out of time. And so taking out carbon that is being used unintentionally or unthoughtfully through not thinking through our intermodal transfers, to me, that sells a really big opportunity to help us get better on track to meet our goals. And I think that really has to be the focus, is what can we do within the timeline that's feasible and implementable today.
And Martina, just thinking about electrification, I mean, if we take Europe as an example, how far advanced is the electrification, and how much is there left to do? It's quite far advanced, isn't it?
Yes, fortunately, it's much more advanced than the example Lance just gave us from the US. We are running in Central Europe, in Germany, for example, to have some facts. We are running on 95% electrified tracks, even for the freight system. And the electric energy, Marla, is coming to an extent of 2/3 out of renewable sources. So in Germany, it's already the fact that the train system is the chance to get a fast switch from getting off the CO2 heavy emission truck system in saving CO2 with rail. Here we have an average train is carrying the amount of 50 up to 52 containers. And this is bringing a reduction in CO2 with every ton transferred from road to rail of 80% now. And we will come up to a reduction of 100% CO2 in the early 1940s. So 2040s, what am I saying? Sorry for that. So what I'm telling you is that electrifying the tracks is much more efficient than all critics might think. And in Central Europe, it will be the fastest initiative to get renewable energy into the system, not only in Germany, where Deutsche Bahn is the biggest buyer of renewable energy for their train systems on the market, but also in other European countries. So there, we have not much time, as Marla said, but there is a good means of initiatives and instruments to really switch the traffic to a carbon neutral way to transport.
Martina, just a quick question from the floor, then I'll come to Maggie. I mean, how much are you looking at hydrogen on the railways? Is that part of your thinking for the next 20, 30 years?
Yes, it is. In those areas where electrification of the tracks is not really feasible or paying off, there we are having at the moment tests of hydrogen trains for passenger transport, and also hydrogen locos for freight. So, but since the system is electrified to a large extent, it's not that much needed in the railway system. But with respect to heavy trucks, hydrogen might be one of the most efficient alternatives to today's system.
And Maggie, thinking about rail freight as an answer to decarbonisation, as far as shifting goods off lorries, but also facing its own sort of decarbonisation challenge, what's the biggest thing for the industry in the UK as far as getting to net zero?
Well, so I think it's inevitably in two parts, and one is the push for more electrification. We're not as fortunate as Martina in terms of the amount of the network that is electrified that freight can use at the moment. So, we are, pushing the government to try and increase that proportion. They announced 2 routes last week, really around the passenger network, but when they are done, that will give some more opportunities for freight. But I think, as Marla says, every day that passes, more carbon goes into the atmosphere. And so whilst these things are very difficult and imponderable, we also have to focus on that. And that's why, modal shift obviously is hugely important to us, and getting as much across onto rail freight, even if we are diesel hauled today, and then doing the things that we can do today to make a bit less carbon every single day. So running the trains longer, for example, is a really, really good way of doing that. It's exponentially better for every load that you put on the back of that. We've got people looking at synthetic drop-in fuels like HVO. They're not the long-term solution, but they are helping today to produce that amount of carbon that we're using. And obviously, measures around fuel efficiency, reducing idling, using sort of automated systems to switch off engines in depots and terminals, and all of those measures that we can do alongside, other elements of sustainability like air quality reduction, emission reductions and biodiversity, to just try and do the best that we can in the short term, whilst inevitably the debate about can we afford to electrify the network, or what pace will we do it at, or which route is next, whilst those conversations take place. So you can't do one or the other. You have to be doing both, but tackling what we can today is so important.
But just on that pace of electrification, I guess, Maggie, and then Martina, I'll ask you the same question. Are you disappointed with the UK government's pace of electrification? And is rail freight sometimes ignored with just all the focus on passenger journeys and electrification? Could actually a lot be achieved if ministers actually concentrated also on trying to electrify those key freight routes?
So I think passenger and freight electrification to some extent is the same question. We've got, a relatively small network, 10,000 miles, and a very significant proportion of it is going to have to be electrified for freight and passenger use. So we need to be getting on with that at pace. And, I think last week's announcements were helpful in that regard. It's, 2 more big routes, but the supply chain are keen to have a sort of a forward programme. And, Martina will probably reflect on the German experience, which is you just have to keep doing some every year, and suddenly you've got your network covered. And that's what we've not been doing in the UK. And so now we are playing catch up on that. And I think the other bit that we don't think about very much if we, look forward, because obviously there's always a cost implication now, but electrolysing hydrogen is, it consumes electricity, charging batteries consumes electricity, and actually overhead electrification is really energy efficient. So when we get out to 2040 or 2050, if electricity is by that point, a bit of a scarce good in some respects, because there'll be so much demand for it, the case for overhead electrification is just made. And I think we're sometimes not factoring that sort of angle into the decision mix. We're very focused on the cost today, but not necessarily about what it will mean for the overall generation mix in the future.
And Martina, what can we learn from Germany, and what do you think of the pace of electrification in the UK?
Well, I think Maggie has already mentioned it could be a little bit faster, that pace. And what I think what will happen now is that things get a little bit more optimistic, I would say. I think the awareness, government's awareness, is growing so much. Just again, a few numbers. All across Germany, the CO2 emissions from the whole traffic sector has been 164 million tons a year, and this is stable since the early 1990s. So nothing happened to reduce the amount of emissions. Why did nothing happen? Because the transport sector and all the traffic flows increased to such an extent that the measures taken did not effectively reduce. Now, the European and the German government have decided to cut CO2 emissions from that sector by half until 2030. So that means that the actions will now be taken, since the CO2 emission as a second currency is coming into play. It's not only the profits and the cost taken now, but it's the awareness that if we do nothing at this very moment, then our costs will increase gazillion fold, so to say, in the next 10 years. And I think that paradigm change has already happened. We can see that since last year, I would say, coming through in the middle of the corona pandemic, because then governments realized that you can have a vaccination against corona, but no vaccination against climate change. And, I think things which have to come first is the acknowledgement that we have to do something. And now we have to come up with concrete actions. And there, we are offering those actions as a railway system in Germany to the government and to our customers. And I think perhaps that could also be done in the UK.
Great. Well, very good to get that perspective. Let's widen things back out and think about the wider supply chain and freight industry and decarbonisation. Marla, do you think it's actually too big to think of it as one sort of amorphous entity that needs decarbonisation, and we need to drill down a little bit and maybe think about digitisation and technology?
I think that those might be one and the same question. I think, yes, the supply chain is expansive with many modes and many, many stakeholders, but I actually think digitalization is the thing that can tie us all together. Circling back to something that I said a while ago is the biggest capital expense is producing the data, right? Making sure that you have the sensors, building the data architecture, and creating a data feed. And so one of the things that we've seen in other industries is saying, okay, let's have one central area where many of the stakeholders interact with. Whether, in passenger transportation, that's a city or transit system. In the freight sector, that's likely a port or a large intermodal facility. Let's have one intermodal facility say, in order to be able to get privileged access to this facility or a better customer experience and potentially eventually a requirement in order to access the facility, you produce those data. Once you have that one piece, the cascading effects across the full supply chain are massive. And so I think if you think of it creatively in that way of what is the domino we need to, tip over, I think that we have lots of opportunities to do this a lot faster than if we think about it as a large supply chain across many countries with all these different moving parts and stakeholders.
And just thinking about the costs of decarbonisation, Lance, I mean, what do you think the most expensive part is going to be? And will that feed down to the end user, be it a consumer or industry or whoever it may be?
I'll get there, but let me cycle back to your question to Marla.
Sure.
I think because I think I have to get to your answer. I mean, it's an incredibly complex ecosystem that's global, and we have to look at that level. But we can't look at that level and find out how we tier out our investment structure until we understand the individual bits. And so we have to take a systematic analysis. Doesn't mean, well, we just look at the big picture. We have to look at all those silos and then make rational choices. And so I can't tell you exactly what's going to be the most important bit, but I know that it's going to take some step-by-step infrastructure investments. And I guess two things on that process. I think it was Maggie mentioned that, sometimes you have to just start and little by little you get there. And we all struggle, and we struggle as societies to deal with important but not urgent issues. If we were great at them, we'd all look like fitness professionals because it'd be the best thing for our health. We'd eat right, we'd exercise all the time. God knows I don't. And maybe many of us don't. It's the same thing for transportation policy and infrastructure. We don't start dealing with these things until there's a problem. Then we chase after it. And we're starting to chase after it on a global basis. And now we'll look briefly at the United States. We are now on our third president that talked about infrastructure. And finally, we've passed a piece of legislation on hard infrastructure, classic infrastructure, the kind of things that we're talking about today that could have a meaningful bit of impact. And that's that starting that Maggie talked about. And where that will lead us, well, we'll have to guide, and there'll be certainly new rounds of public and private investment to find out where's the cheapest way of dealing it. But I do know the most expensive way to deal with it. It's a mandate that says, right now you must take out X amount of emissions with a known technology, and it has to be done within 5 years. that tends to be expensive, not effective, and kind of frankly stupid, because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know how it's going to work together. And you're often leaving the easy answers that are sitting there for Marla to discover with her digitalization effort. So, I mean, I don't know exactly where the expense is, but we're not going to find it if we just don't think systematically.
Martina, you were nodding there.
Yeah, exactly, because it has to, you have to take kind of bold decisions at the very beginning. You have to decide what path you are going to embark on. Are you working on getting hydrogen into the trucks, or are you working on getting electrification into your trucks? And these decisions are not easy. That I admit, but I do think that there's a lot of intelligence now being put into that decision, because there might be another factor we have to think about. I think global capital seeking investment is now much more guided than in the years before by the ESG context. And now we, as a rail provider, are being contacted by investment companies asking us, can we do a private-public partnership together to get the big things done, because we want to invest in infrastructure firsthand, but that should be then CO2 neutral and efficient. And combining these efforts, combining banks and transportation system, that could be one part of the start of the solution in that direction, because there is a lot of money globally. And this money, needs, of course, some profit, but if it's invested properly in infrastructure, then it has a very long-term perspective of growth. And we have to, embark on that path, and I think it's the right time now.
And Maggie, just rounding off, thinking on decarbonisation, how important is what we were talking about there about policy certainty and a long-term horizon as regulators try to push the industry, the rail freight industry, towards decarbonisation?
Yeah, I mean, it's vitally important. And I think, Martina's articulated it really well there. But, sometimes I think there's a danger that, you think, well, we'll go down the electrification route, but there's not enough pace in the programme. Or maybe you'd look at hydrogen, but, then perhaps that's going to be, secured for replacing gas in domestic heating. Or perhaps you might want to look at battery, but you're uncertain about, the global supply of cobalt and lithium and the essential metals in that. And so you do what, as Lance says, you do nothing. And people I talk to people out there who are putting off investment decisions today for those sorts of reasons, but also, there may not be enough power in the local distribution networks, or a whole host of other reasons that are causing people to do nothing. And that's why, amongst the people that I represent in our business, we're trying to focus people on those short-term gains, because these things, they take policymakers a long time to come to. Setting a target is easy, delivering a policy change is hard, and that's where we are at the moment. And we don't need more targets now. We need some direction. So let's all keep, as individuals, doing what we can to make less carbon today, whilst keeping the pressure on the policymakers to set that direction.
Absolutely. We just got one question from the floor to finish with. It's for Lance in particular. And the audience member is curious to learn more about how US infrastructure experts will be drawing on the European experience, maybe around rail in particular. Is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I think that the policy world is global. It's not just big conferences like COP26, but for the many years ago when I was in government, I read the policy papers of what's going on in Europe. The Europeans and the Americans and the Asians speak quite frequently. So I think we all do learn from each other. And each nation has its own and unique challenges. But I mean, I think the source of optimism is, again, you can't manage a secret. And we've discussed two topics today, one about sustainability in the transportation network, and the other one about sort of the bottlenecks in supply chains. They're getting a lot of attention by both the private and the public sector. As Martina mentioned, with the ESG focus, there's real returns in the marketplace. And that means everybody's out there looking for solutions and seeing a couple of common problems. And we humans have done pretty good at solving problems in that kind of context. We create a good mess once in a while, but we usually come around.
Sure. And Marla, I'll give you the final word. What's the one thing that our audience should take away from this, thinking about the future of rail freight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing to take away is that we're doing a lot of really important work, but we need to be thinking beyond electrification. We need to be thinking about what we can do with technology today to better optimize the assets that we already have.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. A fascinating and really wide-ranging discussion there, and yeah, an industry that's never been closer to the headlines. So thank you all very much indeed. Well, join us after the break, where today's host, Peter Campbell, will be discussing new mobility concepts disrupting the car industry. We'll see you in a moment.